He thought she mopped floors. He was wrong. She was about to remind them exactly who they'd been mocking.
Jason Miller learned to tie his shoes with double knots because the soles were peeling apart, and a double knot bought him one more month before the seams gave out completely. He was 11 years old, thin in the way that made his elbows look too big for his arms, and he walked to Lincoln Middle School every morning past the same cracked sidewalk, past the same chain-link fence, past the same boys who had already decided who he was before he ever opened his mouth. His mother, Diane, left for work before sunrise and came home after dark, and to Jason that meant only one thing. She cleaned offices downtown, rode 2 buses to get there, and came home smelling like industrial soap and exhaustion. He never once thought to ask why a woman who scrubbed floors for a living kept a locked filing cabinet in her bedroom closet, or why she disappeared for entire weekends twice a year with no explanation beyond work trip. Kids don't ask those questions about their mothers. They just accept the shape of the life they're given. What Jason didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Diane Miller had built and sold a logistics software company 11 years earlier for more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and that she now sat, under a name nobody in this town would recognize, on the boards of 3 companies that controlled warehouses in 40 states. She hadn't touched a mop in over a decade. The cleaning job was a costume, one she put on every single day, because she had made a promise to herself the day Jason was born that he would grow up knowing what it felt like to be poor before he ever learned what it felt like to be rich. She wanted him to understand people. She wanted him to earn respect, not inherit it. She had no idea how much that promise would cost him. The promise had roots that went back further than Jason's birth. Diane had grown up the daughter of a man who inherited a modest fortune and spent his life surrounded by people who wanted access to it more than they wanted him. She watched, as a girl, how that changed a person, how he grew suspicious of every friendship, how he never fully trusted a compliment, how he died wealthy, and, in the ways that mattered most, achingly alone. She swore she would never let money define how people treated her. And when she built her company from a spare bedroom with 2 employees and a used laptop, she made the decision early that if it ever succeeded, she would keep that success separate from her real life. She hadn't expected to become a mother before the company took off. When Jason came along, the plan simply expanded to include him. Every morning, before the sun came up, Diane put on second-hand scrubs she'd bought specifically for the role, packed a lunch she didn't need, and left in a car 12 years old that she kept registered under a shell entity so no curious neighbor would ever trace it back to anything unusual. She wasn't naive about the risk. She knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a life built on a lie this large could crack under the wrong kind of pressure. She simply believed, for 11 years, that the value of the lesson outweighed the danger of the secret. She would come to question that math in ways she never anticipated. The bullying didn't start with a punch. It started, as it almost always does, with a joke that wasn't really a joke. A boy named Tyler Grant, whose father owned the biggest car dealership in 3 counties, noticed Jason's shoes on a Tuesday in October and said, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear, that Jason's family probably ate government cheese for dinner. The table laughed. Jason laughed too, because laughing along hurt less than staying silent, and silence would have meant admitting the joke was true. It got worse from there, the way these things do when nobody stops them early. Tyler had an audience, and an audience needs a show. He started calling Jason Food Stamp, dropping it into hallway conversations like it was Jason's actual name. He knocked Jason's tray off the table twice that semester, both times by accident. Both times with a smirk that told everyone it wasn't. He went through Jason's backpack once while Jason was in the bathroom and held up a folded, water-stained permission slip that Diane had signed with a shaky hand after a 16-hour shift, reading her signature out loud in a mocking, exaggerated voice. Jason never told his mother. He told himself it was because he didn't want to worry her, but the truer reason was shame. A quiet, corrosive shame that told him if he complained, it would only confirm what Tyler already believed about him. So instead he ate lunch faster, took different hallways, and became very good at making himself small. Some kids build walls. Jason built a kind of invisibility, and he wore it like armor for almost 2 years. There was a teacher, Mr. Alvarez, who taught 7th grade science and noticed more than most adults in that building bothered to. He'd seen the way Jason flinched when Tyler's group walked past his desk, the way Jason's grades had started slipping in small, quiet increments that nobody else seemed to track. He pulled Jason aside once, in October, and asked if everything was okay at home, and Jason told him it was fine, because 11-year-old boys are remarkably skilled at saying exactly the words that end a conversation they don't want to have. Mr. Alvarez didn't fully believe him, but without more to go on, there was little he could formally do. He started keeping a closer eye anyway, the kind of small, unglamorous vigilance that rarely gets noticed until much later, if it ever does. At home, Jason had built a second, smaller life that had nothing to do with school. He loved building things, model bridges out of popsicle sticks, elaborate marble tracks that wound through the living room. Anything that let him solve a problem with his hands instead of his words. Diane encouraged it fiercely, buying him kits with money she could easily have spent on something extravagant instead, sticking to the modest budget she'd assigned herself years earlier. In that garage, surrounded by glue and cardboard and half-finished contraptions, Jason was someone entirely different than the boy who shrank through school hallways. He was confident. He was curious. He was, in the only place that felt safe, entirely himself. By January of 7th grade, the invisibility stopped working. Tyler had grown bored with quiet insults and wanted something bigger, something with an audience big enough to matter to him. The school was hosting its annual Family Career Day, where parents came in to talk about their jobs, and Tyler's father was bringing a brand new demo car to park outside the gym doors, chrome catching the winter light, the whole spectacle designed to remind everyone exactly whose family mattered in this town. Jason begged Diane not to come. He told her career day was optional, which was a lie, and he told her he'd rather she just stayed home and rested, which was true, but not for the reason he gave. What he meant was, please don't let them see you the way they'll see you. Please don't give Tyler more ammunition. Diane, exhausted and aching from a week of shifts that weren't real, but that she still performed with total conviction, agreed to skip it. She hugged him at the door that morning and told him she was proud of him, and Jason nodded and left without meeting her eyes, carrying a guilt he didn't fully understand yet. Career day went exactly the way Jason feared it wouldn't need to. Tyler's father arrived in a suit that cost more than Jason's mother made in a month, shook the principal's hand like they were old friends, and gave a polished 15-minute talk about entrepreneurship that ended in applause. Afterward, in the hallway, Tyler cornered Jason near the lockers with 2 friends flanking him and asked, in front of a small gathering crowd, why nobody's mom had come to talk about mopping floors. The crowd laughed. Someone filmed it on a phone. Jason said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, and he walked home that day taking the long route so no one would see his face. The video made its way around the 7th grade by that evening, the way these things always do now, passed phone to phone in group chats Jason wasn't part of and never would be. He didn't see it himself until the next morning, when a kid he barely knew showed it to him in the hallway with a laugh that wasn't unkind exactly, just thoughtless, the laugh of someone who hadn't considered that the boy in the video was standing right in front of him. Jason watched 15 seconds of himself standing frozen, saying nothing, while Tyler performed for a crowd, and something in him went quiet in a way that felt different from the usual quiet. This wasn't just an insult anymore. It was evidence, permanent and shareable, of exactly how small he'd let himself become. He stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria after that, choosing instead to sit in a stairwell near the band room, where almost nobody passed through during 4th period. He told himself it was temporary, just until the video stopped circulating, just until people found something else to talk about. But temporary things have a way of becoming permanent when nobody intervenes, and Jason spent the better part of 3 weeks eating alone on a concrete step, listening to the muffled sound of a trumpet section rehearsing through the wall, wondering if this was simply what the rest of middle school was going to feel like. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Jason cried where his mother could hear him. Diane found him sitting on the floor of his room with his back against the bed, and when she asked what was wrong, the whole story came out. Not gracefully, not in order, but it came out. The shoes, the food stamp comments, the backpack, the career day humiliation, all of it. 2 years of silence breaking open in 20 minutes. Diane sat on that floor with her son and listened to every word without interrupting, and something in her chest went cold and still in a way it hadn't in over a decade. She had spent 11 years protecting Jason from a version of the world where people respected you because of what your family owned instead of who you were. She still believed in that lesson, but she had never accounted for what it would cost him to learn it while other children weaponized it against him. She held him until he fell asleep, and then she sat alone in the kitchen until nearly 2 in the morning, staring at the filing cabinet key on her keyring, turning over a decision she'd avoided making for years. She didn't decide that night to reveal everything. That wasn't who Diane was, and dramatic gestures had never fixed anything in her experience. But she decided something quieter and, in its own way, more important. She was done being invisible in the one place where her invisibility was actively hurting her son. The question wasn't whether to act. It was how and when, and in a way that would actually change something instead of just making a spectacle. She thought, too, about Mr. Alvarez, whose name Jason had mentioned in passing months earlier as someone who'd once asked if he was okay. Diane called the school the next morning, not as Diane Miller, the cleaner whose name barely registered on any roster, but simply as Jason's mother requesting a private conversation with his science teacher. Mr. Alvarez confirmed, gently and carefully, everything he'd suspected but never had enough to report. The flinching, the isolation, the slipping grades, a pattern he'd watched develop over months without ever having quite enough evidence to act on. Hearing someone else confirm what her son had endured, someone who'd witnessed pieces of it firsthand, hardened Diane's resolve in a way that Jason's own account, as painful as it was, hadn't fully managed to do alone. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern the adults around her son had noticed and failed to stop. That realization changed the shape of what Diane was willing to do. She had planned, at first, to handle this quietly. A private word with the principal, perhaps a request that Tyler be moved to a different homeroom. But quiet fixes rely on the goodwill of people who had already, for 2 years, demonstrated they weren't paying close enough attention. Diane decided the response needed to be proportionate not just to what had happened to Jason, but to the culture that had allowed it to continue unchecked for so long. The following week, Lincoln Middle School announced an emergency parent-teacher forum, prompted by a formal complaint about bullying that had been quietly filed by a parent the administration hadn't expected to hear from at all. Diane Miller, it turned out, had spent that sleepless night not fantasizing about revenge, but making calls to a lawyer she retained but rarely used, to the district superintendent's office, and to the principal directly, requesting a meeting under her legal name, the one that appeared on corporate filings and foundation boards, but never on a school pickup form. If you've ever watched a room full of confident adults realize they misjudged someone completely, you understand what happened in that principal's office. Diane arrived not in a cleaning uniform, but in the same understated, expensive coat she wore to board meetings 3 states away, carrying a folder of screenshots, dates, and a formal letter from her attorney outlining the school's obligations under state anti-bullying statutes. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She simply laid out, calmly and precisely, 2 years of documented harassment that the school had never once investigated, and asked exactly one question: How had this been allowed to continue for so long without consequence? The principal, visibly shaken, promised immediate action. But Diane wasn't finished. She requested one more thing. Not punishment theater, not a public shaming to match what her son had endured, but a mandatory assembly on accountability and empathy, funded personally through a foundation grant she arranged to have delivered anonymously to the district that same week. She wanted consequences. She also wanted, strange as it might sound to some, a chance for the boy who'd hurt her son to actually learn something instead of just being punished into resentment. She also asked, almost as an afterthought that turned out to matter more than anything else in that meeting, that Mr. Alvarez be formally recognized for the attention he'd paid when almost no one else had. It cost the district nothing beyond a letter in his file and a small stipend Diane quietly arranged through her foundation, but it mattered to her that the one adult who'd actually tried to help wasn't lost in the shuffle of an institution scrambling to protect itself. The principal, still adjusting to the reality of who was sitting across from him, agreed to everything without a single objection. News of the meeting didn't spread the way the hallway video had. Diane had been careful about that, requesting confidentiality wherever the law allowed it, unwilling to trade her son's private pain for a public spectacle just because she now had the means to make one. But something in the atmosphere of the school shifted within days anyway, the way it does when adults in a building suddenly start paying closer attention. Teachers who'd let hallway comments slide began stepping in. Hall monitors who'd been half present started actually watching. Nobody needed to know exactly why. They only needed to feel, correctly, that someone above them was finally paying attention. Tyler Grant found out who Jason's mother really was on a Thursday afternoon, called into the office alongside his parents for a meeting he assumed would be about detention. Instead, his father sat across from a woman he vaguely recognized from a business magazine profile he'd skimmed years earlier, a woman whose company's software, it turned out, ran the exact logistics platform his own dealership used for parts inventory. The realization crossed his face in slow, uncomfortable stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of pale, sinking understanding that the janitor's kid he'd let his son mock for 2 years was the son of someone whose reach extended further than his own ever would. Tyler didn't get expelled. Diane had specifically asked that he not be, over the school's initial recommendation, because she wasn't interested in destroying a 12-year-old's record over cruelty that adults around him had failed to correct. Instead, Tyler was assigned to community service alongside Jason at a local shelter, an arrangement that felt, to Tyler's parents, uncomfortably generous, and to Diane, exactly appropriate. She believed people could change if you gave them a hard truth and a real chance, not just a punishment to resent. The first few shifts at the shelter were silent and stiff, 2 boys sorting canned goods without looking at each other. But something happens when you work alongside someone doing something genuinely useful, stripped of an audience, stripped of the hallway performance that had defined their entire relationship until then. By the 4th week, Tyler asked Jason, quietly, without any of his old smugness, whether it was true that his mom used to actually run a real company. Jason said yes. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and then said he was sorry, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a performance either. The shelter's director, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth who'd run the place for nearly 20 years, noticed the 2 boys before either of them said much of anything to her. She assigned them tasks that required cooperation on purpose, carrying folding tables together, sorting donations into matching bins, small logistical partnerships that forced conversation neither boy would have volunteered for otherwise. She'd seen plenty of court-mandated volunteers pass through her doors over the years, most of them counting down hours until they could leave and never think about the place again. Something about these 2 felt different to her, though she couldn't have said exactly why at first. By the 6th week, Tyler started showing up 10 minutes early, a detail Ruth noted but didn't comment on. He'd started talking to some of the shelter's regular guests, an elderly man named Walt in particular, who'd once run his own small business before a series of medical bills took everything he had. Walt talked to Tyler about the fragility of fortune in a way that no lecture from a principal ever could have. And Tyler, for the first time in his life, began to understand that the line between his family's success and someone else's hardship was thinner and more circumstantial than he'd ever been taught to believe. The story could have ended there, with an apology and a shelf of canned soup, and for most families that would have been enough. But Diane had one more decision to make, and it was the hardest one. Jason had spent 2 years believing his mother was poor because she loved him imperfectly, in the only way she knew how, and now he knew the truth. Not just that she wasn't poor, but that she had let him suffer inside a lie for reasons she believed were right. He didn't resent her for the money. He resented, quietly, that she hadn't trusted him enough to tell him sooner. Diane didn't defend herself the way many parents would have. She didn't say he was too young to understand, or that it was for his own good, and leave it there. Instead, she sat him down one evening in April, months after the assembly and the shelter shifts and the slow rebuilding of Jason's confidence at school, and she told him everything. How she'd built the company after his father passed away, how she'd been terrified of raising a son who measured his worth in things instead of character, how she now understood that lesson had a cost she hadn't fully weighed, a cost that had landed on him instead of her. Jason listened the way he'd learned to listen to hard things over the past few months, with more patience than most adults manage. He asked her, finally, why she couldn't have just told him and still raised him the way she wanted. Diane didn't have a perfect answer, because there wasn't one. She told him she'd been wrong to think secrecy was the only way to protect the lesson she wanted him to learn, and that she was sorry it had taken watching him hurt to understand that. He asked her other questions too, over the following weeks, in the scattered, unpredictable way children process large truths, not all at once, but in pieces, at odd hours, whenever a new detail occurred to him. He wanted to know why she still took the bus sometimes. He wanted to know if she was going to make him move to a bigger house, and felt an unexpected wave of relief when she told him not unless he wanted to. He wanted to know, most of all, whether the mother who'd sat with him on the bedroom floor that night, the one who'd held him until he fell asleep, had been real, or whether that too had somehow been part of the costume. Diane told him that was the one thing in 11 years that had never once been an act, and something in Jason's chest finally, fully, let go of a fear he hadn't realized he was still carrying. One night that summer, he asked her the question he'd been circling for weeks without quite landing on it directly, whether she was disappointed in him for not standing up for himself sooner, for letting 2 years pass in silence instead of telling her the first time Tyler called him a name in that cafeteria. Diane took the question seriously, the way she'd learned to take all of his questions seriously since that night on the bedroom floor. She told him that the failure hadn't been his silence. It had been every adult around him who should have noticed sooner and hadn't, herself included, and that a child should never have to be the one responsible for ending his own suffering. Jason turned that answer over for a long time afterward, and something about hearing it lifted a weight he hadn't fully realized he was still carrying. Diane also, in that same conversation, made him a promise she intended to actually keep this time. Not a promise built on secrecy, but one built on honesty going forward. She told him that from now on, whatever decisions she made about money, about the company, about his future, she would make them with him in the room, not around him. Jason didn't fully understand yet what that would come to mean over the following years. A seat, eventually, at conversations most 12-year-olds never get access to. A front-row education in responsibility that no classroom could have taught him. But in that moment, what mattered to him was simpler. His mother was finally talking to him like someone she trusted, instead of someone she needed to protect from the truth. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel exists for stories like this one. The quiet moments where someone gets a second chance to do right by the people they love. If that's the kind of story that means something to you, hit subscribe, because there's more of this waiting for you every week. By the following school year, Something had shifted in Jason that had nothing to do with money. He still wore the same shoes, because Diane, true to her principles, hadn't rushed to replace his entire life overnight. But he walked differently. He'd learned that the worst thing anyone said about him in a cafeteria had never actually been true. And more importantly, he'd learned that the people who say those things are usually working from a script written by their own insecurities, not from any real understanding of who you are. Tyler and Jason never became close friends, not in the way movies like to tie things up, but they became something quieter and maybe more honest. Two kids who'd been forced to actually see each other, once with cruelty and once with truth, and who now nodded to each other in hallways with something that looked like mutual respect. Tyler's father, humbled in a way few business owners ever are, quietly donated a percentage of dealership profits to the district's anti-bullying programs for the following 3 years, a gesture Diane never asked for and never publicized. Mr. Alvarez kept teaching 7th grade science, unaware for a long time that the stipend he'd received that spring had come from the family of the quiet boy who used to eat lunch alone in the stairwell by the band room. Jason told him eventually, in 8th grade, mostly because he wanted the man who'd once asked if he was okay to know that the question had mattered more than he probably realized at the time. Mr. Alvarez, Jason would say years later, was the reason he eventually decided to become a teacher himself, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of the quiet, unglamorous habit of paying attention to a kid nobody else was watching closely enough. Diane went back to wearing her old coat and taking the bus most days, not as a costume this time, but because she genuinely preferred the rhythm of an ordinary life to the version of herself that sat in boardrooms twice a year. She kept the company, kept the boards, kept the quiet reach that had saved her son from 2 years of silent suffering the moment she finally chose to use it. But she stopped hiding the truth from Jason, and more than that, she stopped hiding the parts of herself that made her human. The guilt, the fear of getting it wrong, the willingness to change course when the evidence showed her she needed to. She did make one change that spring, small enough that almost no one outside the family noticed it. She started attending school events again, not as a spectacle, not with any announcement, just quietly showing up to the spring science fair in the same coat she wore to the grocery store, standing at the back of the gym while Jason presented a working model bridge he'd spent 6 weeks building in the garage. When his category was announced and his name was called for 3rd place, she clapped louder than anyone else in that gym. And for the first time in 2 years, Jason didn't feel a flicker of dread wondering who might be watching. He simply felt proud, and it was, he'd say later, one of the best afternoons of his childhood. Years later, when people would ask Jason what it was like growing up not knowing his mother was worth more money than most of his classmates' families combined, he'd tell them the truth. For 2 years, it was the loneliest secret in the world, and for every year after, it became the reason he understood something most wealthy kids never learn: that money doesn't make people kind, and the absence of it doesn't make people cruel. And the only thing that actually determines who someone becomes is whether somebody, at some point, chooses to see them clearly and tell them the truth. That, in the end, was the lesson his mother had wanted him to learn all along. It had simply taken a much harder road to get there than either of them ever expected.